comical artist.
I'm Tim Lloyd, the director of the American Folklore Society. Happy to see you all here this afternoon. This is the first of what we are hoping will be a series of occasional presentations co-sponsored by AFS and the department. We haven't exactly identified a topic or a theme or a fundamental subject for those talks, but I suppose it would be something along the lines of expanding the horizons of the folklore studies profession. And so in that light, I think this is a particularly good way for us to start with my friend and my colleague Bill Ivey from Nashville, Tennessee. If Wikipedia had an article, and it may, about successful and varied careers, I would not be at all surprised if Bill's picture would be at the top of that article. Bill grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. After studying history at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and folklore right here at Indiana University, he went to Nashville, where he served as the director for the Country Music Foundation for 26 years. At the end of that time, he went to Washington to become the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts during the second Bill Clinton presidential administration in the late 1990s. And after his time at the endowment came to an end, he returned to Nashville and became the founding director of the Curb Center for Art, Enterprise, and Public Policy at Vanderbilt University. And during his time at the Curb Center, about 8 years ago or so, he served as the team leader for the Arts and Humanities part of the Barack Obama presidential transition, essentially leading a set of discussions and meetings to set the sort of pathway for and to help determine the leadership for the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Institute for Museum and Library Services, all part of our federal government. And since retiring from Vanderbilt a few years ago, he's been the principal in a consulting firm called Global Cultural Strategies, also in Nashville. Bill was AFS president in 2006 and 2007, and since, during his presidency, we began our cooperation with the China Folklore Society on a number of different collaborative activities, and Bill has been the senior advisor to that effort for the last 10 years, which is still ongoing. As he has said a lot, and may plan to say sometime in the next hour and a half or so, folklore was never in his job description. Being a folklorist was never in his job description, nor was it over the door of any of the places where he worked. But his folklore training, primarily here at IU, has been relevant to him every day of his professional life. And I think his career, his career is a wonderful demonstration of the relevance of folklore studies training to productive work of many kinds. And in fact, that is part of the point of the book that he's working on now, about which he'll be talking. His books, along similar lines, are not exactly folklore books, but they're books on the arts and cultural policy world and the essentials for a strong democracy, but written from a folklorist perspective. So the books are an example of that phenomenon that I just cited. He is the author of Arts, Inc., written in 2008, How Greed and Neglect Have Destroyed Our Cultural Rights, a book on the arts and cultural policy world, notably including both the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. And then 4 years later, 2012, Handmaking America, a back-to-basics pathway to revitalized American democracy, which attempts to identify a set of progressive values to counter the sort of consistently drummed home message of the right that you should be afraid and only we can protect you. So that was relevant certainly at the time at which it was written. I think it's particularly relevant today as well. Today Bill will be talking about a number of things, but he will be focusing on his forthcoming book. It'll be titled Folklore, Culture, and Public Policy, right?
That's right, so far.
So far.
All right, I'll talk a little bit about that.
Yes, which will be published later this year in time for the AFSA meeting in Minneapolis by the Indiana University Press, and I think all of us are pleased to see the IU Press jump back with both feet into the folklore publishing business. It's really a good thing. So, without further ado, please welcome Bill Ivey.
Thank you, Tim. A nice introduction. It's great to be back here at Indiana. It's great to be filling the role of visiting research scholar, which I've been at now for about a year. It's good to see old friends, especially Elliot Oring. Elliot and I, a half century ago this month, we're just beginning our second semester as graduate students here at Indiana. So it shows that life can be fairly long, even if it's not always what we would want it to be professionally. But it's great to be here. I wrote this out because I wanted to make sure I stayed within a time limit, and so we'd have plenty of opportunity to interact, because I really do want you to respond to the ideas, big and small, that I'm going to be putting forward in this new book. So if it's okay, I'll read this and maybe make a few excursions one side or another, but basically I want to present it that way. At the end of my remarks, we can talk about anything. We can talk about the argument that I'm making here, or we can talk about how the NEA is doing in Washington and what the Trump administration might or might not do. We can go in that direction also. Also, I will make a slight apology to my SPIA friends, to Geronimo Woronkowicz and anybody else from SPIA who's here, because I will focus on the folkloric aspects of this book, and there is a public policy part of the argument that's going to be alluded to a lot, but in terms of the specifics, it's not going to come forward quite as much as maybe the folklore piece. So I'll do several things this afternoon. First, read excerpts from the most recent draft of several sections of the book. Second, I'll talk to you about the way I'm structuring the argument. In other words, how the chapters are going to lay out, what key people and ideas will be featured, and finally I'll present the major assertions that I'll make about folklore studies and the importance of our discipline. And then we can talk, and I very much encourage your comments. But if you think the whole project is a mistake, if I'm just totally wrong, save those comments for the review that we will publish perhaps in the beginning. A few weeks before the 2015 AFS conference in Long Beach, I received an email note from Gary Dunn of the IU Press requesting a meeting. We got together in the book exhibit area. Gary and his colleague Janice Frisch presented an interesting idea. How would I like to write a book about folklore in the general style of my two other books, Arts, Inc. and Handmaking America? After a short conversation, I said yes. We all shook hands. A few months later, my agent completed the deal. I was off and running. We agreed that the new book would be of interest to folklorists, but would be aimed at a general reader. Maybe a concerned, college-educated mom eager to understand a world order that might seem today to be in disarray. So I had an assignment. I had a vague idea that I wanted to write something that would be, in effect, an argument on behalf of our field. An argument that would somehow connect folklore with larger concerns in society, politics, and international affairs. In a subsequent conversation with Gary and Janice, I agreed to write an afterword addressing the current political situation, spring 2017. Now, it was months later, during a solo walk near my summer home up in northern Michigan, that the idea came to me. If you check my agent's website, Sarah Lazen Books, or if you listen to Tim, the title is Folklore, Culture and Public Policy. That's actually a fake title, because I think the real title could be very easily picked up and co-opted, not by another book, which would be fine, but by a newspaper or online columnist just wanting to use my shorthand and maybe run with it. But I'm going to tell you here what that real title is, and I just will trust that you will keep it quiet. So the real title is Folklore, Unlocking the Secrets of Our Post-Enlightenment World. The subtitle telegraphs the idea that struck me while I walked by Lake Superior, that we are today at the end of the Enlightenment, and that the ideas and practices of folklore studies can help us understand and engage the challenges of this great transformation. I'm going to read a little bit from a draft of a preface or prologue to the book. And there are 2 or 3 different ways in, and I think if I read each of them, and I don't know which order these will appear in, or even for certain that they'll all be used, but I think this will give you a feeling both for what the argument will look like and also the way in which I approach it, which is not really as a scholar, but more as a writer hoping to convince people of my point. Prologue. This is a book about the times we live in. There is great uncertainty in the air around the world and in America. Global disarray has been explained as a response to globalization, instability in a post-Cold War era, fecklessness of modern governments, the collapse of the hegemony of liberal democracy. It has been laid at the feet of religious extremism and economic decline and blamed upon the frustrations of underpaid workers, resentful of governments and wealthy elites who have taken their livelihood. Such explanations are helpful but fall short of the mark. In truth, we are immersed in a sea of great change that extends beyond politics, and like the Renaissance, the Dark Ages, and the Industrial Revolution, our age will one day have its own name. But that will take time. Now we must simply do our best to understand where we are. While we cannot yet label the backward glance theme that will one day explain the way our present shape life going forward, we can see what is drawing to a close, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is an 18th century philosophical political movement first defined in the 1950s by historians looking back at the intellectual underpinnings of late 18th century political revolutions. Ideas most famously memorialized in Thomas Jefferson's assertions that all men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights, and that governments derive powers from the consent of the governed. Like our unnamed period of transformation, the Enlightenment's lasting effects expanded well beyond politics and government, shaping the way modern people think about every aspect of life. Seeds planted by Enlightenment thought matured decades later as an array of universalist theories and movements that today sets the limits of the way we think about change, character, society, and even human desire. For more than 2 centuries, the handshake between Enlightenment thinkers and everyday people produced a shared commitment to social justice, human rights, civility in the conduct of nation, citizen participation in government. This Enlightenment consensus promised the benefits of science and held out the hope that well-built secular societies could offer a workable version of heaven on earth for all. The notion of universal human rights, science and rational thought, the values of market democracy, and assumptions about progress have inspired the United Nations, NATO, Doctors Without Borders, and the family of man. But the dream and ultimately the Enlightenment consensus failed in execution. Despite alluring rhetoric, perhaps because of it, belief in a new, just, and inclusive order was accompanied by arrogant certainty advanced by nationalist pride. This generous universalist vision, implemented through imperial conquest and colonial oversight, was in the end too controlling, too dismissive, too exploitative, too dishonest to retain the enthusiasm of ordinary people over the long haul. So today the Enlightenment consensus is broken, replaced by powerful loyalties and attitudes that disdain science, distrust leaders, subvert government. Anti-Enlightenment power lies in 2 unconnected places: in a rising China that never experienced the Enlightenment at all, and a transnational religious fundamentalism acting on anger fueled by centuries of objectifying external domination. If modern civilization still embraces the Enlightenment, we must begin again with a commitment to social justice, civility and conflict, human rights, and to democracy through a genuine cosmopolitanism, one that respects traditional societies and their values, one that understands the limits of our 19th century enlightened ways of thought. So my argument is two-pronged. What evidence exists that our global Enlightenment consensus is at its end? And where can we look to find the understanding and actions necessary to ward off disaster and start again? In search of answers, we'll critique the assumptions of civilization and explore the expressive life that has always lived alongside the conceits and explanations crafted by civilization, the world of oral tradition, lore, and communal norms. It is this world that the Enlightenment first embraced but then abandoned as lofty principle was overtaken by commerce, exploitation, and control. We must explore the legacy of the Enlightenment from a new perspective and revisit the history and insights accumulated by a venerable but underappreciated academic discipline, folklore studies. The term folklore was first defined nearly 2 centuries ago. Today, the philosophical and political environment that opened the door to an understanding of myth, proverb, legend, folktale is crumbling. Folklore grew from intellectual revolution. Now the way folklore engages the public can help preserve and even revitalize values assumed to be permanent that are now slipping away. Okay, that's one piece of the preface. Now here's another approach. This is also, it was the worst bottle of wine I'd ever tasted. Hilton's own brand, an attempted Sauvignon Blanc. My first sip generated a palate wince equal to an accidental swig from a vial of vanilla extract. but I was at least sipping the vile concoction in a pleasant spot, the presidential suite on the 8th floor of Hilton, Quebec, because at the time I was president of the American Folklore Society. Late October 2007, fall in southern Canada. Night settled in early, and this Friday, gusts of wind swept cold rain across corner window views. Beautiful scene of Quebec's Parliament building, still floodlit late at night, nobody around. Beyond old battlements were the plains of Abraham and the St. Lawrence River, where 18th century British troops fought the French, scaled cliffs protecting Quebec. As with many celebrated global landmarks, the plains weren't quite as expansive as I had expected. I was wrapping up a 2-year term, and tomorrow at 3 would deliver my presidential address. The talk hadn't come easily, and I'd spent the afternoon writing and rewriting, then rushing from suite to business center to room again, printing, revising one version and then another. I knew where I wanted to go, but couldn't quite get there. In truth, I was an odd fit as president of the society. The AFS could trace its origins to the late 1880s, and for most of its history, the organization was home to university-based teachers and scholars, professionals in the field of folklore studies, dedicated to collecting and analyzing songs and tales, legends, quilts, jokes, cabins, myths, and recipes. More recently, the Society welcomed professionals who worked outside the academy, consulting or leading government cultural agencies or city nonprofits specializing in oral traditions, customs, storytelling, and songs. The expressive lives of communities defined by ethnicity, nationality, work, race, or gender. I didn't fit either category. Yes, I had a degree in folklore and ethnomusicology, but it was an MA plus years of coursework and on it, short of the gatekeeping PhD that legitimated serious folklore work. And I spent most of my career heading Nashville's Country Music Hall of Fame. Yes, country music possessed credible roots in the folk traditions of England, Europe, and Africa. I'd completed a stint as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, but my current job, directing a cultural policy center at Vanderbilt University, was further off to the side. My career hadn't really been in folklore at all. I knew what I wanted to say. Folklore studies is very important. In all my years in country music, with the NEA and at Vanderbilt, my training in folklore had been critical to making the best of each situation, each opportunity. It was the study of folklore that gave me a practical sense of how the complexity of American culture could be taken in whole. And it was folklore studies that provided insight into the passions, motivations, prejudices, and assumptions that energized the colleagues, competitors, critics, and adversaries who populated my professional life. I'd looked over the work of dozens of folklore specialists and pulled out the insights and observations that could be plumbed for understanding. It was nearly midnight and it was time to stop. The speech was set, but I knew it wasn't finished. I stood up, walked to the west wall, scanned the handful of late-nighters scooting across Parliament's Westbury Mall, and glass raised and taste buds braced, took a swallow of the worst wine in the world. So that's another way in, which I also talking about folklore. And I'll read part of a third way in, because I think it illustrates something of the character of the book I'm working on. In a New York Times opinion essay in the summer of 2011, Neil Gabler, senior fellow at USC's Norman Lear Center, lamented the absence of new big ideas that could, quote, ignite fires of debate, stimulate other thoughts, incite revolutions, and fundamentally change the ways we look at and think about the world, unquote. Big ideas can be grasped on their merits, not on assembled evidence. They should explain many things, not just one or two. They should be universal or nearly so, strong enough to help us understand many things in many places. Noting that today what passes for big themes is usually a little more than observations, Gabler advances names from the past: Carl Sagan, Daniel Bell, Reinhold Niebuhr, Betty Friedan, Marshall McLuhan, as architects of ideas that could penetrate the general culture. In his argument against the downsizing of big thinking, Gabler himself, almost in passing, puts forward a big idea of his own. This is a fairly long quote from Gabler. It is no secret, especially here in America, that we live in a post-Enlightenment age, in which rationality, science, evidence, logical argument, and debate have lost the battle in many sectors, and perhaps even in society generally, to superstition, faith, opinion, and orthodoxy. While we continue to make giant technological advances, we may be the first generation to have turned back the epochal clock, to have gone backward intellectually from advanced modes of thinking into old modes of belief. Gabler's observation was an aside, a tossed-off explanation of why, in the summer of 2011, big ideas seem to have faded from our American intellectual landscape. But the rise of global terrorism, already firmly on the horizon in 2011, called out for fresh thinking. No longer living in a Reaganist, triumphalist, post-Cold War era, we needed a new big idea strong enough to allow America and much of the world beyond our borders to cope with a new reality. I'm convinced, and this I get somewhat repetitious, this happens to me, I'm convinced that we're living in the essence of Gabler's observation. The Enlightenment has lost its hold on the world, the standing of science, secularity, human rights, inclusive politics has been disabled. Too often the effects of Enlightenment thinking were imposed on previously suppressed people. Too often the world, beyond the reach of civilization's charms, were forced to simply go along. So today we must abandon the conceits of colonial and imperial thinking, envisioning and building a new relationship within the metaphorical border where the world of literacy, sophistication, and manners intersects the oral world of tribal practice and ancient religious belief. Folklore studies can provide the knowledge and insight essential to forging this new, attentive relationship between civilization and billions who live in other ways. So that's kind of the way the preface will work, and I don't know how much of that will be separated out, what will come first, and so on. I'll read a little bit about, this is for the introduction, this will be more about the Enlightenment itself, but I'm trying to condense compress the entire story of the Enlightenment into about 4,500 words, which is, not that easy to do. In his properly revered 1958 tale of a Nigerian Igbo community encountering British imperial power, the novelist Chinua Achebe documents the struggle for cultural authority within the border separating civilization from traditional lifeways. Achebe offers a sympathetic but clear-eyed window into the ambitions, jealousies, alliances of African tribal society, in which the author's flawed hero, Okonkwo, navigates a complex network of ritual and custom that determined standing and influence within his village. Contact with British authorities, when it comes, precipitates disaster. Okonkwo's friend, Obierka, tells him of the white man's arrival in the village. A quote, this is from Obierka talking to Okonkwo. The elders consulted their oracle, and it told them that the strange man would break their clan and spread destruction among them. And so they killed the white man and tied his iron horse to their sacred tree, because it looked as if it could run away and call the man's friends. I forgot to tell you another thing which the oracle said. It said that other white men were on their way. They were locusts, it said, and that first white man was their harbinger, sent to explore the terrain, and so they killed him. So Okonkwo embodies the community confrontation with outside authorities. He, in the end, takes his own life. The British district commissioner contemptuously refuses to take down Okonkwo's body because such an act, quote, would give the natives a poor opinion of him. He reflects upon his experiences bringing civilization to Africa, decides he will write a book entitled The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. The novel, of course, has been widely read and has been properly understood as a fictionalized but real cultural tragedy. Set in the early 20th century, Achebe's novel is surrounded by what we know of Africa and colonialism. We understand that while a few may fall, these strangers will be back in greater numbers, armed with laws, the conceits of civilization, powerful weapons. No matter that the Igbo can fight back at first, the die is cast. The West and its values will conquer, marginalize, and in the end, eliminate whole societies grounded in morality, folklore, and tradition. I'll read just a little bit more of this. Folklore studies is an uneasy offspring of the Enlightenment, a perfect illustration of the 18th century's embrace of every man. The discipline's attentive engagement with traditional communities always harbored nascent criticism of the way policy actors fail to implement or even honor their stated commitment to universal human rights. Folklorists engage ordinary people by listening and observing, intent that the artistic and social values of oral communities held just as much promise for human advancement as did the claims of Hegel, Rousseau, and Jefferson. Let's see, I don't think I need to really know. Let's not even talk a little bit about the structure of the book, because I think you may want to comment or tweak it there. There will be a prologue and an introduction, and 6 chapters. Chapter 1, William Toms and the Discovery of Folklore, folk-lore. 2, Richard Dorson and America's Borderland Society, Dorson's work in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Then there are two chapters, each titled The Spirit of Folklore. And I call it The Spirit of Folklore because a couple of the people involved aren't folklore scholars, but I think they exhibit what you would call the spirit. So the first chapter, Spirit of Folklore 1, has three characters highlighted: Joseph Campbell, Alan Lomax, and Jane Jacobs. The second chapter, The Spirit of Folklore 2, has three: Henry Glassy, Del Himes, and Pat Turner. Then we have chapter 5, which is the Great Folklore Scare of 1974, which is really about Archie Green, the pushback from government, Dorson's role, the creation of the folk arts program at the NEM. It's a pretty, well, there is a dissertation about it, but more could be written. And then there is chapter 6 is the conclusion, which is sort of Enlightenment 2, which is more about the failure of the Enlightenment and what goes exactly where. I'm not sure, but let me read a little bit of how the conclusion starts. This is probably going to change. I don't really love it. I mean, I sort of love what I was trying to do, but I don't think I actually succeeded. It starts with a quotation. The war on terror, for all its uncertainties, is in some respects a war of values. The monstrous methods of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others are but a reflection of their authoritarian values and extremist ideologies. They hate us, not just because we are rich, but because we are, on the whole, free, liberal in thought, and humane in feelings. I mean, I think it's a hilarious quotation. But then I try, I go into my own text. On October 13th, 2016, King Bhumibol Adulyadej died, and Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. The two events are not linked, but they rhyme. Adulyadej was the last Enlightenment modern monarch. Born in the United States while his father studied at Harvard, a direct descendant of the ruler who inspired The King and I. Although he fully embraced Thailand's monarchical culture and values, he was educated in Switzerland, spoke impeccable English and French, composed music, played jazz on the clarinet and saxophone, wrote, painted, took up photography, and spent hours in a greenhouse in his Chitrilada Palace in Bangkok. In his attachment to civilization and heritage, he was the last of the colonial-era kings, the last of a cohort of princes who retained the loyalty of their people while also adopting and legitimating the secular values of Western Empire. With his death, the thin residue of Enlightenment influence on traditional people evaporated. And then I talk a little bit about Bob Dylan developed in quite an opposite direction, beginning with the vernacular to accomplish an end run around the most cherished, hierarchical artistic values of civilization to win its biggest prize. He grounded his artistry in folk oral tradition, achieving global success and respect while circumventing not only classical music, but classical music's American stepchildren, Broadway musicals, and the pop of Tin Pan Alley. In 1950, if you were a top critic, you wrote for the New York Times and covered the NBC Orchestra and musical theater. Scroll forward to 1970, and you covered Bob Dylan's shift into rock and roll for the new magazine Rolling Stone. So that's the way I get into this, kind of the conclusion. And then there's a discussion, the people I'm really attacking here are the 4 or 5 big thinkers around contemporary international relations. That would be John Mersheimer, Francis Fukuyama, Sam Huntington, and Richard Haas with the Council on Foreign Relations. And those are the guys I'm kind of after. And I'm not saying too much about that. To foster change, to make things better in the future, we must begin with an understanding of where we are now. This essential fundamental starting point will inevitably be incomplete and imperfect, and so on. It goes. There follows, in the conclusion, a discussion of Marxism, Freudianism, Darwinism, as a kind of macro sphere in which we do our thinking, critique of Fukuyama, Mersheimer, Huntington, and Haas, and their ideas about global priorities and power. I'll read a little bit of the afterword. Takes us up to the present. And this is changing daily. I could get up this morning, here's Elliot and I did watch MSNBC, and write completely new things about where we are. This is afterward, America, 2017. Obama White House spokesman Josh Earnest, in his last interview with MSNBC's Morning Joe, was asked by host Mika Brzezinski about reports that the incoming Donald Trump White House would close the press room relegating correspondence to a space in the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door. Ernest answered that this was important. It was important that the new administration, quote, maintain traditions. A week later, Ronell Jones and Sonia West, both professors of law, elaborating on Ernest's point in a New York Times opinion essay, noting that there was one pillar of press freedom that Trump now seems most keen to destroy, colon, tradition. And then here's a quote from them. It is primarily customs and traditions, not laws, that guarantee that members of the White House press corps have access to the workings of the executive branch. This is why we should be alarmed when Mr. Trump defines tradition, vilifies media institutions, attacks reporters by name, and refuses to take questions from those whose coverage he dislikes. This truth, that huge chunks of government policy exist not in law or regulation, but in traditionalized experience, would not surprise Del Hines or Richard Bauman or Pat Turner. In a more expansive vein, 2 days later, Times columnist David Brooks also ventures into the folkloric realm, lamenting the corruption of America's true myth. His take on the genre is surprisingly cogent. Here's a quote from Brooks. Myths don't make a point or propose an argument. They inhabit us deeply and explain to us who we are. They capture how our own lives are connected to the universal sacred realities. In myth, the physical stuff in front of us is also a manifestation of something eternal, and our lives are seen in the context of some illimitable horizon. This, of course, would make Joseph Campbell spin with delight. So far, so good. Brooks then takes a shot at the American myth. America is at the vanguard of the great march of progress. America is the grateful inheritor of other people's gifts. It has a spiritual connection to all people in all places, but also an exceptional role. America culminates history. Wow, that's great. That's for me. Perhaps more mythic than real, myth, but Brooks' heart is in the right place. Sorry, I didn't read that very well. Early 2017, bombarded by political analysis featuring custom, tradition, and norms, an observant citizen might get the impression that in stressful times, Americans revert to the comfort of traditional explanation. In fact, as folklore studies have learned to argue, this is true. The stories that explain us and the underpinnings of our beliefs and actions reside in traditional lifeways, not in laws, written accounts, or official rules of behavior. When the thin conceits of civilization weaken, we wisely fall back on the communal assertion of folk belief and practice. And then, in the fall of 2016, following an especially exhausting and bitter exercise in democratic process, real estate developer Donald J. Trump was elected President of the United States. In speeches and through social media, the 2016 Trump campaign floated ideas that, if implemented, would shatter key precepts of U.S. law. The religious test for foreign visitors, constraints, and so on. Here is where my overarching argument resonates in this moment. In its suspicion of science, distrust of government, the press, and highly educated leaders of business and government, the Trump campaign was framing a distinctly American rendition of anti-Enlightenment sentiment sweeping the globe. In valorizing ethnic distrust, undermining the rights of women, dismissively suggesting that opposing voices be silenced or removed from the hall, Trump was not only marginalizing key legal and constitutional principles, he was undermining the Enlightenment consensus that had brought a measured civility to the post-colonial world up through much of the 20th century. I'll stop there. What I have are a list of the big ideas that are going to be embedded in this book. And some of them are really big. And others are ones that are kind of sidebars that will be interesting to folklore, so it might not even resonate with, say, a general reader. And these are not in order of importance, so pay attention. If one of them just grabs you and you want to fight me on it or elaborate on it, by all means do so. 1. William Thomas went beyond the Grimms by suggesting that folklore was within something like folk life. So folklore has roots in other, and I would say folklore has a special resonance in the U.S. setting. 2, Dorson introduced the idea of the U.S. as a border society. That's not his phrase. One that spreads the variety and lively interactions associated with international or cultural boundaries throughout an entire nation. Dorson wrote and thought practically, and his theory for American folklore is not a very compelling argument, but I think he acted very theoretically in going to the upper peninsula of Michigan and seeing this kind of universe of interaction and difference and preservation and change. Three, folklorists are only true cosmopolitans. In contrast to Anthony Appiah's sort of internationalized, civilized version of sort of frequent flyer mile characters who he calls cosmopolitans. I would say we were romantic cosmopolitans, but that's another conversation. Four, the general trajectory of folklore studies. Now this is a big one. Okay? The general trajectory of folklore studies from the mid-19th century to the present has been to move from gathering interest in stuff to analyzing movement and change to advancing universal process. In other words, starting with a kind of accumulation of what I call folkloric big data to Himes and Ballman and others talking about the process of traditionalizing. So you go from collecting stuff to Five, folklore studies is uniquely suited to the complexity of the U.S. situation. A diverse society with no historical ethnic hegemony that's really held together by a commitment to principles. There's no real dominant overculture, and so this makes it a really interesting place for folklore to work. The Enlightenment was intellectually expansive and inclusive, but undermined by colonialism, imperialism, and so on. That's so on about that. 7, the final collapse of the post-World War II Enlightenment consensus, science, rationality, government by consent, human rights, rule of law, etc., is a global phenomenon that best explains our current situation, linking the Taliban, the Tea Party, and Trump. And the challenge is really to the big international policy thinkers who I don't think really understand that. 8, the practical impact of the Enlightenment from the 19th century until today can be seen in assumptions and actions derived from vulgarized, reductive renditions of 5 isms. Marxism, which gives us economic man; Freudianism, which gives us behavior shaped by subconscious childhood experiences, sexuality, and so on; Darwinism, which really gives us a sense of movement and progress and competition and triumph; and then liberal capitalism, which is the thing that everybody has to strive for. And this is all bundled into the work of nation states. And I think that's kind of the framework. That's the playing field we work on. 9, this is another one that's sort of big. You could probably sense this from my comments. My basic worldview is that there is a thin crust of something that we could call civilization. And it has a set of characteristics, which I have written down, and I'll enumerate them if you want. And then it kind of lives over the pejoratively named other, which are oral societies, traditional culture, previously suppressed people, the public. You can use a lot of different terms or phrases for it. But that's my model. In other words, civilization and something else, and the something else is where folklorists have done a lot of their work. 10, folklore was one of civilization's first and ultimately its best arena of engagement with everyday people. 11, folklore as a listening discipline offers present-day policy actors a new way to engage traditional societies. Exchange replaces send. And then I have a question I'll throw. Anybody can comment on this. Elliot and I talked about this. At least out of the gate, it's changed somewhat recently, but anthropologists wanted to go far away and go into really remote societies that were really different, that were really self-contained. Folklorists became very good at working with societies that were complicated in that, you're in the bar collecting a folk song while the TV is on showing, the news. And anthropologists initially didn't like that sort of ambiguity. Folklorists have been historically really comfortable with it and good at it, and I think it was essential to engage in the U.S. situation, but I think it's one of the virtues of the field. So I'll just stop there. Now, there are 3 or 4 of those things that I said can be argued with or commented on. Yeah, Jason.
This is just a suggestion based on your list. I think number 3 or 4, it's logical that you would go to Dorset and the UP where you have some knowledge and ties.
Yeah.
You're going to have readers, though, that will never read the rest of us. And my hope would be that you could at least touch on Americo Paredes and the southern border, given the context of your work and its politics.
Sure.
For most of us, I suspect suspect we'll find your argument compelling, but it's not the first go-to place that most of us in the field have for the idea of America as borderland. And
Yeah.
I think that given the fact that we're talking about building a gigantic wall, there's reason to look to the southern border too.
That's a great suggestion, and I'll look at it and bring it into the argument. One of the things that I'm trying to do is, and I gave a speech when we had the 25th anniversary of the NEA, and I gave a talk at a little Harvard seminar that we did, and I tried to advance this idea of the U.S., advance the idea of border as pure metaphor. In other words, Bloomington, Indiana is a border society. So I think Paredes is important because of the timing of when he was doing what he was doing. But I also want to try to advance that idea that the border is a pure metaphor. So that is a great suggestion. And I'm also trying to.
The trajectory is going to be differential identity, right? I mean, by the time we get to Bauman's articles about our argument about differential identity, as you suggest, the border is pretty much everywhere you find folklore. Because folklore has a role to play when different kinds of groups are in contact.
Well, that's right.
Which is the American experience that you're being talking about.
Thank you. I can I quote you, or will you charge me? So small royalty. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, and as it happens in the first chapter of with his pistol in his hand, Paredes performs a kind of takedown of fake news about incidents there. So I mean, it's got another
Okay. That's
sort of trajectory
well, that's good.
into your talk. Into your work.
Talk to me.
I've got a question.
Okay.
So in the context of all of what you said and some of the things you've alluded to, what are the most productive roles that folklorists can play today?
Yeah, I think that in a way, I mean, this is where it gets really hairy, where my argument gets difficult, because on the one hand, I'm actually going to be arguing that one of the virtues of folklore is that in a generalized way, it hasn't let itself become too politicized or become the handmaiden of a political agenda. And to me, that's a virtue. It has stayed primarily observational and analytical, and it has really tried to, if the Enlightenment pulled previously suppressed people into the stream of history, it's really folklorists who have tried to give the individual members of traditional communities a place in that history, so that it's not just some kind of an abstraction. And so that, I think, is really a virtue. If you go to the other extreme and you say, I'm running a counterinsurgency operation in Afghanistan, and the Petraeus doctrine, which does talk about culture, says, get me a folklorist so I can understand this community and go in and manipulate it in some way. Well, that's exactly not what you're talking about when you say what folklore should do. So I think that the role is, and I'm glad you asked the question, because I haven't quite figured it out, but I'll throw something out. That if you look at the relationship between civilization and ordinary people, or public, or the other, I've got about a dozen phrases or terms, because the other is awful. You have civilization and then no good single word for everybody else. But one of the main points of contact has been in things like art and cuisine. And there's been a comfort level. We'll let the art in. We'll let the food in. We'll even let some fashion in. Maybe music, yeah. But we won't let models of societal practice. We won't let models of governance. We won't let in other words, gaze of civilization has ultimately been fairly contemptuous of the real character of of things other than civilized society. And there's just been this tendency to assume that the thing to do is to simply spread civilization by force if necessary. So, to circle back to your question, Tim, I think the challenge is to say, well, what we need, say, we need to learn from China. How do you structure a society? How does a society work that doesn't proceed from Enlightenment assumptions, but still is a successful society and is admired by the people who live in it and very accomplished, as opposed to simply either assuming that it's just like us, and what you have is sort of an Enlightenment-fueled transaction, or that it's alien and hostile, and that your job is to fix it, get rid of it, get it out of the way. And I think the folklorist is in a great position to talk about traditional communities in a way that values the deeper meaning of lifestyle, that doesn't just skim the expressive life, skim off expressive life and stop there. I don't know if that's it, but you don't want, it's, in some ways you want the State Department to say, yeah, I'd like a folklorist to come in and talk to us about this. And that's fine, but that there is a slippery slope there.
Yeah, so it's interesting you're going to plan on framing this book in terms of the Enlightenment. It sounds like it might even end up in the subtitle. But I also hear you worrying about the Enlightenment and signaling a critique of the Enlightenment, and that seems awfully important. So, I mean, if we think of the late 18th century and ideals of the social contract and democratic participation, that's only possible because most of the world is enslaved, exploited, colonized, excluded, ignored. And sure, there was great interest in the world's peoples and their traditional knowledge, but only on the terms of European systems of classification and its extensions in the US. So I'm just trying to think about, and I heard that critique.
So far I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, I heard that critique. I'm just wondering how it's going to be there right from the start and how that plays out and sort of how you bring the Enlightenment into an understanding of our contemporary world.
Yeah, well, if I were going to put it in shorthand, and I maybe, obviously, the way I expressed it in this draft was maybe not clear enough, but I think that the way of looking at the Enlightenment today is something that is intellectually promising and was a failure in implementation. And it was a failure in implementation because it simply became a point of departure for imperial expansion and colonial occupation. And if you take people and treat them like crap for 200 years, eventually they stop believing you. Even if your message is great, even if the UN says X, even if the family of man has pictures of everybody, all the families are like, well, so somebody starts saying no. Maybe we should go back and look at, so that's one part. So I'm looking at the Enlightenment as something that's just sort of, its influence is just dissipating. And maybe it's just natural. It's something, how long did Romanticism last? How long did, any of these big deals, they all have a life or a half-life. So maybe it's just winding down. This is something I've been thinking a lot about. I went by pretty quickly, but I think there's a framework that people operate out of, if they're policy actors, if they're intellectuals, or whatever, that we can't get outside the boundaries of it. And I think the Enlightenment has handed us that. But it comes to us indirectly. It comes to us through a set of isms that were created in the 19th century that I think they were enabled by Enlightenment thinkers. They said, now it's okay, Marx, Darwin, Freud, to make universal statements about mankind, because the Enlightenment says we're all in this together, so it's fine to be universal. So these thinkers start making these universal statements. Well, then you get vulgarized versions of what they said. All these thinkers are very subtle, and there are a lot of complexities in their arguments. But it comes down to usually 2 or 3 bullet points that actually stick. And so to me, it's Marx and Freud and Darwin vulgarized and reduced to a few thoughts, along with a belief in the virtue of market democracy, that defines our playing field. We don't get off of that. And I think and I'll say 2 specific things. One is, I think it gives us a framework where it's very hard to deal with evil. We just don't know how we confront evil as mental illness, basically. And if you've got one article after another talking about ISIS recruits, is about, what was their childhood like? How did they go wrong? Well, they were in a middle-class family. Well, they must have been mistreated at home, or it must be, they were bullied at school, or they don't have jobs. So it's either you either have a kind of a psychological, dime store psychological explanation, or a economic man explanation. And and to really confront evil and just say it's very hard to do out of that box. And so that would be the second thing I'd say about the legacy of the Enlightenment, is that can we move beyond it? I'll say something really. I had the opportunity, because of a pirated book in China, to read Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs in one sitting on a flight back to the U.S. from China. And if you read it, you see Steve Jobs. If somebody like that showed up in sort of a traditional society community framework, here's a guy who's got a machine, and he says, you always use this as a machine, but now this machine is your friend. You can bring it into your home. It will love you. You will love it. It's beautiful. It's comforting. You might do what the Igbo did with you might tie the machine to a stake and cut his head off or something, because it would be so alien. And if you read that biography straight through, you see a figure who would be maybe best interpreted as a magical character, or a shaman, or a Christ-like figure. All the quirks he has, but he's analyzed either in terms of his ambition or his biography. That he's explained either psychologically or through economic assumptions about economic ambition. And so to me, I said, well, wow, maybe a traditional, maybe a non-Enlightenment way of thinking actually could help us figure out certain things that are coming at us. That is what I would call an esoteric thought. We've only got about 5 minutes before we.
Actually, till 1:30.
Oh, 1:30. Okay. Oh, that's right. We started at 12. Oh,
Well then.
Professor.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to ask you to say something about civilization. You said you had some thoughts about civilization. That seems problematic to me. It seems like it would be awfully easy to demonize civilization, and yet I can think of constructions in which civilization could be viewed positively. So I wonder what your thoughts are about civilization.
Well, I would say, as a sentence, I'd say civilization is great for civilized people who live in it. It works. If you play by civilization's rules, it works. Now, I characterize it as being urban, literate, sophisticated, mannered, organized, powerful, modern, entitled, confident, wealthy, in history, progressive, international. That's and it's got those characteristics. And then when I think about, I think of some of the terms I'm going to use these different. I don't like the other. I may use it once, but I'll use ordinary people. I think that comes from Sarah Palin. I'm using all kinds of sources. Ordinary people, traditional communities, rural people, oral communities, everyday people, proles, that comes from Orwell, people, regular people, subnational groups, previously suppressed people, the public, powerless, you know, all those things can be used to sort of characterize other, and to me that society is oral, unmannered, unsophisticated, often rural, not powerful, venerable, but not modern, not civilized, of course, which is those territory, religious, rich in relatedness, subnational or transnational, and often outside history. Now, I absolutely would agree that it's good to bring some of the benefits of civilization to people, but I think we I don't use the word value. We underestimate the burdens or the changes that come along with those benefits. And one of the things that I've had the chance to do is look in a very cursory way at a couple of centuries of sort of political history and how, I've got a quote in here somewhere, just the British talking about India, what they were doing. They were on a mission to bring the benefits of enlightened English society and politics to these people. Well, India is a functioning democracy, but what happens when you start dividing up and you create made-up countries from the old Ottoman Empire? What happens when you take Africa and divide it up this way and that way? And there's that strong sense that, I'll say this as an assertion, I don't believe religion can be replaced by anything except another religion. I don't think belief just goes away. And I would say that if you think of the Enlightenment as ushering in an age of secular rationalism, I think it brings with it a belief system that's as powerful and as messianic and as anything. And one of the symptoms of that, it has very little ability to challenge itself. And I think folklorists actually have been looking at other ways of living that actually can challenge many of the assumptions of civilization. Now, I kind of have been talking around, John, your question.
No, it's very, very good. But let me pose this. I remember in the post-9/11 moment, there was this talk about the civilized people of the world have to come together against this sort of fanatic. So how do you deconstruct that discourse?
Well, look, I would say if we're at a point where the Enlightenment consensus, which is that we're pretty much able to go along with civilization doing its thing, making many of its decisions and judgments on behalf of previously suppressed people, but basically things move ahead. If we look at 9/11 and say, well, no, this is a turning point, now those previously suppressed people, who are not organized mostly in nation states, but sort of transnational, they're not going to take it anymore. So you've got, it's an inflection point where you say, all right, we have to, and this is sort of very much, it's a bipartisan argument. We just have to go out and kill them. Trump, we just have to push harder. They're pushing back, they have to push harder. Well, there are ultimately a lot more of them than there are us. I think that's in the nature of it. And so the folklorists would say, hey, we are at an inflection point. And what we have to do is basically scroll back and start the Enlightenment over. And this time, pay attention. It's not going to be, it can't be, a religious quest to spread the Enlightenment, our idea of the best way of life around the world by force. Can't be that anymore, because we did that for 200 years, and now we know that's, so let's do something else. So, so you say folklorists have actually been quite good at not letting their discipline get politicized and not being mostly, what would you say, enablers. And I do think the folklorist way of looking at the world is incredibly useful right now. That's to say, and that's just a civilization enlightenment argument. I also love the way the language of folklore starts to get used by people talking about the way public policy is made. When all these characters are saying, well, they're not honoring the tradition. Well, what they're saying is the rules of the game that are written down are not adequate. There's this thing off to the side called tradition or custom. They've got to, that's what's important, and that's what's going to sustain us. I mean, so many of these, oh gosh, it was customary to release your tax returns. It was customary to do, and all of a sudden we realize that there's a kind of traditional component to government that's much more powerful than anybody thought. And how does it get passed on? I mean, how does a presidential candidate learn that the custom in the U.S. is to do these three things, and then they do them? And when somebody violates them, it's a huge deal. It's as big a deal as if you break a law. So that's, I see the problem that I've got. There are bad things in traditional societies, and to just go in with and be a romantic cosmopolitan and say, that we can have a conversation with ISIS and work something out, that's naive. Doesn't mean, though, in my opinion, that you can't work, that there's nothing to be said or done. I think there is something to be said, and the question is, how does the folklorist, who deals with the virtues of complex traditional societies, deal with the existence of evil in those societies? We've tended to just not deal. We don't bring that. We choose not to bring that part forward. And if we're going to be intellectual leaders around an understanding of how the world works, then I think we're going to have to, on our own, figure out how to talk about that. And I'm going to have to figure out a way to say something about it because I'll be attacked for it. It's. Yeah.
Just following up on that, I've got a cold here. As you were talking, I kept thinking about D.H. Lawrence's book, Etruscan Places. Are you familiar
No.
with it? Anyway, but in it, when he's talking about the destruction of the Etruscans by the Romans who came after that, and he plays them off each other with what you're characterizing as Enlightenment, traits that are coupled with that of militaristic power and with assumptions of rightness, And so it's not that just Enlightenment, it's that you're conflating those, and I'm wondering rather if they are not these other traits, saying if you have the militaristic power, if you have the tools for domination.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
one of the interesting things about this project is that there are probably 25 things that are like rabbit holes that I could go down
Right.
and never come back. I'm
Yeah.
trying to write a 42,000 word book that covers, a significant part of human history and comments on a discipline and all the stuff. So I think you're right. And one of the figures, and I mentioned this to Elliot in passing the other night, we were chatting about this. Foucault exists in the background of a lot of this. It's very, very hard to write about these interactions of power and powerlessness, or or sophistication and non-sophistication, without the understanding that all of these connections can be, what would I say, demeaned by going to those the deep underlying the deep underlying mechanisms of power, oversight, control, and I'm going to try to deal with him in a note. We'll see if I can get away with that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the other thing that I'm doing that's quite arbitrary is that I'm really making the assertion that folklore, as it has evolved, is really a quintessential American discipline. even when Henry goes to another country, he's functioning as an American folklorist and using models that he applies to these other settings. And I just think the U.S. situation has been especially welcoming to what folklorists do. You know, Tim and I, a number of us spend a lot of time in China. Well, China still has this vast rural population, and they really haven't had to deal with the ambiguity of traditional people in an urban setting where they're rubbing up against each other, and they're trying to preserve values by living in the same neighborhood. No, it's almost as though they're just beginning to even think about that kind of stuff. And the American folklorists from day one had to deal with that. And then also, American folklore really emerged after the biggest period of nationalism as a driver of folklore, which I think really helped us a lot. We don't have a strong ethnic overculture, so we're not committed to Americanness in any huge way. And I think it helped us that folklore really takes off here in the late 19th and into the 20th century.
I have a question, maybe a little more on the practical.
Oh, please.
As a graduate student, so I think all of us here recognize the obvious positive benefits of folklore, folklorists in the world and what we can do.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, what's the current state of our existence as folklorists in terms of, are we going to actually have roles to fill?
Well, that's, you know, look, I didn't make this as explicit as I should have, but this book is really a continuation of my presidential address, which is why is folklore important? And maybe what I've selected isn't the most, you know, isn't the best way of saying it's important. But I would love to have the general public take a second look at the field and have as clear a sense of what folklorists do as they do, say, historians or anthropologists. I think they have a very clear idea. Folklore is a little more exotic. The best thing we've got going for us right now is that when you get into fake news, rumor, custom, norms, the kinds of things that folklorists can comment on that are also in everyday discourse. I think it's a great opportunity for folklorists to talk about what they do, more in terms of process than in terms of material that can be easily put in a little box and tucked away. You know, oh, that's cute old stuff. Isn't that neat? That decoy is really beautiful. That song really sounds, you know. So to me, you know, it's one of the things. Nobody asked me what I learned from doing this process. I mean, I'm still learning things, but I learned three or four things, and one of them is that the characters that I'm singling out for kind of highlighting in this book, and there's 7 or 8 of them. It's Tom's, Dorset, Campbell, Lomax, Jane Jacobs, Glassy, and Delheims, and Pat Turner, and then Archie Green. Those people are incredibly ambitious, productive, and each in his or her own way very aggressive. And so, you know, I think that folklore, in making good arguments, can do that again. You know, we need the big, strong voices and the big ideas to stand up and say, you know, shit, this is really important. You know, this is, you can't. And Himes was kind of in that place. You know, if you don't understand why people traditionalize experience, you don't really know where somebody's coming from. You've got to understand that process if you're going to be a sophisticated policy actor. And I think even as people are writing their dissertations, that have to, you know, you're not going to get to write a dissertation about that. But as people begin to build their careers, to start to make that case, and you know, I tried to get, maybe somebody can help me with it, I tried to get an as presented, as delivered text of Delheim's presidential address that he gave out at the Benson Hotel in Portland. And he sent me one. I was so impressed by it, I wrote to him. He didn't know me from anybody. I was the guy at the Country Music Hall of Fame. He sent me a copy. It was that blue mimeograph deal, you know. And in the talk, he said some things that didn't make it into the JAF version of his talk. And one of them was that he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said that the impulse to traditionalize experience is a cultural universal. And that because traditionalizing is a cultural universal, that gives folklore unique standing as a discipline, co-equal with literature, history, philosophy. Now that's a very, very aggressive, strong statement. Now it wasn't in the other thing he said, if 4 people got stuck in an elevator that broke down between 2 floors, by the time they were rescued 3 hours later, they will have traditionalized that experience. Because that's the only way you can explain what's happened to you, is if you traditionalize experience. Well, again, that's that same notion. And so I think to the extent we can get back to thinking about folklore making and folklore doing as a primary human activity that is indispensable, I think we can then build a bigger space in public policy and in the academy. It's a longer answer than you wanted. Maybe isn't very adequate, but that's.
I guess I'm also concerned about funding.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, look. I mean, well, of course. I mean, and the question is, can you secure? Look, I deal with this with the arts all the time. There is, in the U.S. context, we don't have a good argument for the arts that's not instrumental. You know, that to say having a vibrant, expressive life, being engaged with art making, you know, or creative heritage, that these things are really essential part of quality of life. If you try to talk that way, people just like, you know, okay, yeah, if you just give them a job, then he can learn to play the guitar, he'll be fine. You know, that's it. You'll have culture, then you'll have art. And, or just like the marketplace do it. You know, they can sort it out. We don't need any external input. So all of my friends for the last 25 years have been making these instrumental arguments, kind of small arguments. Teach your kid music, they'll do better on their test scores when they try to get into college. You know, teach them to sing and they won't get in a gang. And, you know, all these and you know, it's been a little bit helpful, but at a certain point, if you're going to get funding, you've got to be in the room where the important things are, so that people aren't asking you, why are you in this room? But they're just asking, what do you need? And right now, folklore is sort of outside the room, where you'll have a conversation about what does history need, and it's got its own problem. But folklore has to say why folklore should be in the room. It's a two-step process, and so I think the big argument is important, just as the tactical one that might get you a grant is important. Like Jason.
This is a continuation, and maybe where you go otherwise, but you gave us permission to ask questions like this.
Sure.
Emily's sort of drifting in this direction, but, I mean, do you think that NEA will survive in the next couple of years? I mean, and this relates to conversations we have all the time, which is that, you know, we put too many eggs in one basket. I mean, we didn't diversify our public folklore ecology the way that we should have.
Yeah.
And I mean, we are extremely NEA dependent on the ground in the United States, and it would seem to me you're well positioned to have an opinion on what's going to happen next.
That notion of well positioned and opinion, you know, there's something slightly. I mean, I have an opinion. I don't know, but
I mean, you've been inside the NEA.
Well, there are several comments I would make. One is that it was pretty widely circulated. There was a article published in The Hill, which is kind of the school paper of Congress, that mentioned things that were going to change, and the NEA and NEH were going to be eliminated. Okay, fine. Well, that comes from those characters in Congress who have always wanted to get rid of it. So the first thing is we don't know how much sway they're going to have. About 10 days or 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration sent somebody into the NEA. So they actually showed up, and their message was, you know, I'm here, I'm going to work here, and you might have to make do with something less. And but you know, we're not interested in eliminating the agency. I would not have taken a job if I were going to go into an agency that was going to be eliminated. So those are 2 trains running. And I suspect that the Trump family has many friends who are big supporters of the arts. They may not be themselves, but I think that up and down the line, including the president himself, would have friends in New York who would be big arts people. So I don't think the administration is going to be especially hostile. Will it protect the agency if the congressional characters put a line item in a budget to get rid of it? I don't think he's going to veto a big bill because there's a line to eliminate the NEA. So those are those kind of two things going. This goes back to my earlier answer. In two sentences, what's the argument right now on behalf of the NEA keeping it? What is the argument? And I'm not sure that we or other advocates really have that at the moment. So we'll see, but there are steps that will happen. The NEA's budget number will come out in April. And at that point, they will know what the administration thinks of them. And then that number has to go through Congress. The NEA is not an authorized agency. And what that means is that it can be taken down on a point of order, on a voice vote, on the floor of the House or the Senate at any time. And it chose to not get authorized maybe 18 or 20 years ago because reauthorization is when Congress can tinker with what you do. So this is when they would say, well, no, you have to give grants in this way, you have to block grant, everything about the agency could change. So the decision was to not try to get it authorized. But what that means is it just lives on appropriations, and it means that it can be attacked really, really easily. So all of these different things are in play. And I don't know what the and I don't know whether folk arts within the agency will end up playing a big role. It has in the past. I mean, it's been kind of a go-to thing to demonstrate kind of mom and apple pie, the character of the agency. It's not just about the violinist, it's about the fiddler. And but right now it's really unknown. But the first out of the gate was that there's not active hostility from the administration, and what showed up in the Hill was coming out of those staffers with the real conservative.
Well, in what you said just a minute ago, you articulated one sentence argument for why have the National Endowment for the Arts, which is something along the lines of a person or a family or community that has a vibrant, expressive life has a higher, vibrant, expressive culture has a higher quality of life.
That's right, but
How's that as
yeah, I think I also tried using, saying the National Endowment for the Arts is an investment in the nation's cultural infrastructure, and the cultural infrastructure is critical to a high quality of life. Where that argument founders is that too often the unconverted just say, well, that's a nice thought, but really, we can't afford that right now. We need to deal with basics, and that's sort of a frill. And I don't know what it takes. That may be the downside of not being like France. France has this great sense of Frenchness, and they can build a lot of structure around national pride and this idea of Frenchness. Very destructive in many ways, but they got that. Well, we just have these sort of Enlightenment commitments to principles, and we try to start hanging cultural identity on that. There's a missing step, which I think folklorists can be. I think there's a vacuum there that good folklore thinking can help fill, which is, and I think Dorson was struggling with this, and Constance Rourke was struggling with this, where you're really trying to make the big argument about what is American character, where do we find it? And it's probably in that border, in finding a way to celebrate the borderland character of the society. But it's very tough too. Folklore, we often think that because we deal with things that are creative aspects of everyday life, that people automatically understand the value of what we're doing. even understand what we're doing. And it's actually the opposite. I think being a folklorist is one of the most sophisticated intellectual activities possible, because you're really dealing, you're elevating things that are often uncomfortable for people. You know, you're an Italian American and you're not proud of that past. You want to get rid of it. You want to be a modern person. You want to be a civilized person. And the folklore say, no, this stuff is really important. Well, why is it important? And, you really get into this stuff, and I think folklorists are the most sophisticated cultural observers I know. But we don't have a lot of sway.
It's also been said that because folklorists work so often with people and communities who are in a position of powerlessness of one kind or another, sometimes of many kinds, that folklorists themselves, as a field, we've developed an aversion to power and to be in positions of power ourselves.
Yes.
Which is where one of the places that it would be good to be able to move these conversations.
Well, that is a great, I was talking earlier about some of the problems that I have, which one of them is how do folklorists deal with evil in the traditional communities that they revere and want to bring forward. And one of the other ones is what should be the character of folklorists' engagement with power. I mean, I don't think it's about, just going off, maybe a little bit too close to home here, but I don't think it's just about the AFS taking a position on a labor action. I don't think that. I think it's a more sophisticated way of engaging than that. I had one of the biggest change that came over me in working on this project was I was always very critical of Archie Green and the position he took on the Tom Bigby Dam and stopping the American Folklife Center from getting involved in that whole story. Because my attitude was, look, you've got to make compromises with power, you've got to advance your field, that's one way to do it. But really, what Archie did fits the other part of my frame, which is folklorists have been primarily observational and have been sympathetically observational, but have not, have not signed on to the Enlightenment empowered version of, hey, we're going to help you. We're going to tell you. We're going to be part of this control thing. And I completely. I was going to write one thing about Archie and his mission, and then I turned around and I'm going to write something completely different about it. And so the folklorists have had this very what would I say? Very ambivalent relationship with power and politics, and tentative. And it's almost as though when you start to really get in the middle of something, then there's a tendency to pull back, or your colleagues will attack you and force you back in some way. And in a sense, I'm not answering the question, because kind of what I'm advocating has a political objective, but I don't really have tactics. And I'm going to have to by the end of this book, say a few things about what should be done that come out of a folkloric sensibility. I'm not 100% sure what those are.
I mean, it may be some kind of equivalent to, if you have a concern about where our country is, run for the school board.
Oh, sure.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, a variation on that argument is if you have a concern about the place of folklore in the arts world, work toward becoming a director of a state arts council.
Yeah.
And move into a position where you have a certain amount of say.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. In fact, and I'm, we were at a conference when we talked about folklore being a listening discipline, and I was sharing and making my usual grandiose assertions about this and that, and Elliot bought me a sweatshirt that said, Captain Macro, meaning, I'm always up here, which is a problem that I have, and I do think, just in terms of American government at the present time, a lot of what needs to happen is really local, and it has to move up rather than from the top down. But, yeah.
was gonna ask about the opposite thing of what you just said, in the sense that one of the things I really like about your work is the Captain Macro-ness of it. That it's these big sweeping ideas. For the last class meeting of my public folklore class, we're going to read Handmaking America, and we're going to read your presidential address. And one of the things I note is that you have a very interesting vantage point for viewing where we are and what we've been engaged with, that I don't see too many other peers stepping up to the type of policy questions that are being asked. When they do, it's often from a cultural critique type of point rather than one of founded in practice. Can you maybe speak a little bit to the idea of both working on the ground and also working in a more macro type of view? Toggling between those two seems to be where true advancement's going to happen.
Yeah, that's actually, I think I take it as a compliment that you like the big idea stuff. And one of the reasons I quote Neil Gabler op-ed piece, which is actually pretty old, he wrote it in 2011, but it has stayed with me. I don't know what the deal is right now. Elliot and I were chatting about this either this morning or last night, that when we got into the field, and you know, as I said earlier, it was literally a half century ago right now. We were kind of getting started. You had these sort of giant characters. You know, you had Dundees and Abrams, you know, big idea people. And Dorson in his own way. I mean, he was a powerful leader. I don't think, I like to say about Dorson is that he didn't speak or write theoretically, but he acted theoretically. You know, the things that he did were quite advanced, but they weren't, you know, he didn't necessarily look back on it and package it all that well. You know, maybe, I don't know that big idea work is rewarded these days. I think that's part of it. And, you know, but we certainly have the minds who could sit there and write big books about policy from a folklore perspective. But I don't know that it's, maybe that it doesn't work so well in careers. You know, folklore, you know, Tim was talking about the fact that, you know, we're not comfortable being very political. We're not comfortable being very successful. You know, and there's this real ambiguity about, you know, as soon as folklore steps up to the precipice of fame and fortune, either she or he pulls back, or the colleagues shoot at it, you know, and they fall over. Like I always think of Jan Grunwald, you know, who had all that success with urban legends. It didn't really help his standing in the field very much. In fact, it almost was a mild negative. Oh, well, Jan, you know, he's just over there, he's got a movie deal, well, too bad, bye-bye to him, you know, he's no longer one of us. And I don't know, I think that is a symptom of a healthy instinct, you know, that there's nothing wrong with saying, you know, we're not about fame and fortune, but I do think that there are times when getting out there in a public arena and really saying something as a folklorist could really make a difference.
But don't you think in our field there's a split between, there's still the split between the academic and the public, and those that are doing the cultural critiques often are not the ones who are engaged in policy issues and policy questions. And so what I'm doing as a public folklorist is pointing fingers back at myself, saying, yet again, I need to be more engaged with the scholarship in that public sphere than perhaps I've been in the past.
Well, look, you know, I got really lucky. I mean, Tim talked about my career path, but I'm the only former NEA chairman who was able to move into a job that was really based on what happened in the chairmanship. Everybody else has just kind of wandered out because work in the arts has so little standing, you know, among foundations of policy actors and these things, that they're really, you know, if you were the Undersecretary of Education, you'd immediately get a job running a foundation if you left government. Because it's, that's, or in the Environmental Protection Agency, you didn't have to be the head of it, you could be number 4 and you'd go out. But the arts didn't work that way. Well, I got polled by Gordon Gee, who was then the Chancellor of Vanderbilt, whose wife had been a big critic of the NEA, and she said to Gordon, "You got to get Bill Ivey to come down here." And that was my opportunity to try to build a policy center around the arts, but it wasn't like I mean, I met with Joe Nye at Harvard. Right when I was still just leaving the NEA, and of course he was then the head of the Kennedy School of Government. I gave him every damn opportunity to say to me, "Bill, when you leave the NEA, come up here and do a 6-month deal with the Kennedy School and talk about cultural policy." And he didn't even. Not only did he not bite, he didn't come close. And so folklore kind of lives in that world. I mean, folklore as a stance, as a policy stance, and I think folklore does have a stance. But as a stance, it lives in that realm of cultural policy, which in the U.S. setting isn't really particularly honored or valued. Jason?
I don't quite accept John's binary, and I think that one of the reasons why you've been able to do this is that you're in a relatively distinctive position. I think that many of our colleagues who would like to do more ambitious policy work see a primary obligation to steward the institutions and programs that they're responsible for. And so the way that I would frame this would be, could you have done the policy work that you've done now from the positionality of the directorship and national of the Country Music Hall of Fame? That would have, you gave you lots of experience, but your political positionality would have been different than as a former NEA chair.
That's correct. I could have done it in terms of I had a pretty wide open job description. What I exerted my personal ambition around getting involved in the Grammy Awards and that process, which was a more organic outgrowth of the country music job.
And it helped your institution as opposed to hindered your institution because you're being torn down in the New York Times every weekend.
Yeah, and Joanna Warakowitz and I were talking about this yesterday, and she's at SPIA, and they're maybe thinking about doing something organized around cultural policy and so on. And the fact that our government, if the NEA truly engaged the entire cultural sphere, so it was dealing with intellectual property and copyright and trade in cultural goods and all these different things, I think we could, then you can build a policy regime because you're really bouncing off the government. There was really no significant health policy until Health and Human Services was created as a Department of Government. There was no environmental policy until the EPA was created in the 70s. And what we're trying to do in folklore and in cultural policy generally is to make policy arguments when you don't really have a receiver at the other end. And I think had the National Endowment for the Arts been involved in a national conversation about the nature of American expressive life, the value of expressive life, in a very general way, I could have made that argument out of the Country Music Foundation position. But because you just had this vacuum there, that's a challenge for everybody. Now I do think that for folklorists, I think this is beginning, which is really, really healthy. I think that the public sector folklorists are beginning to get their legs under them around what are the policy implications of public sector work? How do you build a policy argument on top of the very practical? So the two things are there side by side. And I think that's a place where that can happen. And I know a lot of that can really be effective at the local level. And it's just, it's not my instinct, because if you work at the local level, you have to go out and be nice to people. And that's really hard for me. I always think of Leonard Cohen lately. He was quoted, I think it was in a film about him. And he was talking, the line is, "I hated everyone, but that acted generously and nobody found me out. It's such a great.
Got time for one more question?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it just seems to me, who has nothing to do with public folklore policy, that if folklore wants a seat at the table in public policy, the first thing they have to ask themselves is, what do we know? And how local is our knowledge, or how broad is our knowledge?
Yeah.
If our knowledge is local, we can't get into policy beyond the local.
Right.
If we know community X, we can have an effect in community X, we can advise, we can present our information, we can tell policymakers to attend to X, Y, Z, and Q. If you want to go higher than that, if you want to work at a state or national level, things get a lot more complicated. And it's, all of a sudden then it's not knowing the network of people who are really important, because you knew that in one community, but you don't know it in large geographical areas. So then what is it you know that you can actually, what is it? Tell them when you need to pay attention to culture, or you need to pay attention to the way the communities are organized, or, at a certain, and then let's say you have this knowledge. Then you have to take responsibility for it. Like any scientist has to take responsibility for certain knowledge and realize that it can be misheard, misunderstood, misapplied, misused. And all of that goes along, it seems to me, with any kind of policy orientation that anyone, not merely folklorists, would want to assume.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, and I think we have some one of the things is, can something local be a metaphor for something that then can be applied in a bigger way? That's a possibility. There are two things that we do nationally that I think are really underexplored in terms of their policy implications. One is the Heritage Fellowships, which, where the NEA is recognizing these people and really making statements about diversity and age and personal creativity and relationship to community. And all these things they're not necessarily, they haven't been converted into a policy, but I think the opportunity is there. And then I think what Betsy Peterson has going, I guess she sort of got StoryCorps sort of plopped on her. But when you really think about it, if you think of Himes talking about traditionalizing and sort of a cultural universal, then you've got StoryCorps, where you've got all these people. They're traditionalizing their experiences, and I bought all those Issei books, and I'm going through them because I think that as I get into my conclusion and stuff, or talking about Himes, that's another thing that we can look at. That everybody loves it. It's on NPR every Friday morning. Annoyingly, I don't like it. I mean, it's sentimental. It's got all these things to it, but it is definitely people coming together to traditionalize their experience. So those are national things that I think folklorists can extract value from and run with a bit. But I agree with Elliot. It's like, what do we know? At what level does it exist? How can it be applied? And then, of course, if you really talk about public policy, that has its own language. I mean, you're talking about case studies. You're talking about a whole set of questions that are framed in a way that we're not accustomed to.
What do you think about the way Wynton Marsalis is trying to apply the idea of jazz as the democracy? Is that workable? Something that would fall into that category?
Yeah, I love to hear. I mean, Wynton. Yeah, he's got a great message about jazz as a democratic metaphor and an interaction with diversity and their solo voices that come together in harmony and organized. They play the first part of the chart, and then they go off and do their own thing. And the thing that I have never figured out is, if you're walking in to see Senator X or Undersecretary Y, and you're going to tell them something about that's compelling, and their response is, "Wow, that's really neat. That really tells us something about democracy. Isn't that great? Look how great democracy is. Isn't that cool?" It doesn't convert into, we need cultural vitality
That
as
conversion factor.
as a
So I'm
public
wondering
good.
if it works. Yeah.
If the NEA had been a different animal, if it hadn't had such a intense focus on the fine arts in the beginning and only gradually move out in other directions, if it had really been big enough and comprehensive enough, it could be the, you know, the policy actor that we would bounce our ideas off of. And look, we're fortunate, you know, thanks to really to Archie and Ralph Rinsler and some others, fortunate to have the folk arts presence at the NEA that we have. And it's not a comfortable fit. A lot of people at the endowment still think, why is that there? You know, this is about Brahms and Jackson Pollock. It's not about Bill Monroe. And but I think that absence, nothing to punch.
So are you saying that the endowment would have been more effective if it had been more like a Ministry of Culture?
Oh, look, I've been arguing for Department of Cultural Affairs for a long time, and I had a whole scheme, you know, that was going to be just perfect in the second Clinton administration. You know, when Hillary came in, there's an entity called the Federal Council on the Arts and the Humanities, and it has a lot of members, and it has some interesting, you know, like the Smithsonian is in it. It's not like the National Council on the Arts, it's the heads of government agencies. And the only thing it does is supervise the, what's the word for it?
Indemnification.
Thank you, indemnification. I have trouble saying it, you know, indemnification program. And you know, my idea was we could add a half dozen entities to it, subtract some, get the FCC in there, get the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and then make that a little government deal where you could rethink cultural policy from inside, and it wouldn't require legislation. That committee is entirely appointed by the president, and it's entirely, they appoint the chairman, and the chairman can be inside or even from outside government. It's perfect, because you know, Hillary Clinton could just go in and her people just do it. But you know, that is not, you know, that's not going to happen now. I wouldn't even tell them. I don't want them to do it. Get their hands up. Yeah, that's. I think that moving toward. When you see what happened with environmental policy when you have an EPA, you see with education policy when the Department of Education, all these things are relatively recent inventions of government, and each one of them immediately started some kind of a policy community. And the NEA did it too, but it's like Dance USA, Opera America, you know, American Folklore Society, you know, but it's just a very narrow set of interested parties that care about little segments of it. It's not comprehensive. I've kept you beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.